Hi, everyone, and welcome to the DCRO Risk Governance Podcast, where we're focusing on risk governance issues, learning about the work of and receiving guidance from experienced board directors, senior executives, and thought leaders on issues that are important to those governing organizations. My guest today is James Lam. James and I have known each other for nearly 3 decades. He currently serves as chair of the Risk Oversight Committee for E-Trade and is chair of the Audit Committee for RiskLens, a cyber risk solution provider. He has extensive experience as a chief risk officer, management consultant, and a private and public company board member. He is widely recognized as an early advocate of enterprise risk management and is noted as the first ever chief risk officer. James is the author of 2 books on enterprise risk management, both top sellers on Amazon, and has been a member of 3 of the 4 risk governance councils that developed the DCRO guiding principles for risk governance. Quoted in the Wall Street Journal, Financial Times, The Economist, and other leading publications, James is a frequent keynote speaker for board-level and executive-level conferences. James earned his BBA in Finance and Computers from Baruch College, where he graduated summa cum laude, has an MBA from UCLA, and his CRT certification in cybersecurity oversight from Carnegie Mellon. Welcome, James.
Thank you, David. Nice to spend some time with you today.
Before we get started, I want to let our listeners know that James serves on 2 boards, as I mentioned, and is an advisor to other boards. The comments he'll make should be considered his own and not attributed to any of the companies that he is working with. So James, as I mentioned, you and I have known each other for a long time. We first met in the early 1990s at a conference where you were talking about something we called firm-wide risk management, which has really evolved and become very important as enterprise risk management. Can you talk to us a bit about the progression of your career from that time to today?
Sure. Yeah, it's been quite a while, and I guess we're both ticking. That's good news. But I see a lot of parallels actually between my career and your career, David. We both started in asset liability management and hedging with derivatives. And in terms of my progression, then I got into market risk and credit risk and operational risk. And during that process, the inspiration that I got in terms of enterprise risk management is the usage of economic capital. So how do you allocate capital to risk in a consistent way so you could measure risk-adjusted return? And from that work, I started thinking about, well, it doesn't really make sense to manage risk in silos, and how do companies think about managing risk on a much more integrated basis to be able to have a consistent approach and to also address some of the interdependencies. And during that time, I've played the 3 roles or wore the 3 hats that you mentioned as a practitioner, starting as an asset liability manager, then a chief risk officer, working within an institution, dealing with the culture, the data constraints, modeling, etc. The second hat is a consultant, working with different industries, different companies, understand their kind of unique challenges. And then third hat is as a corporate director, providing risk governance and oversight without getting your fingers in and micromanaging the process. So each role, brings a different perspective, and it's been a good ride.
Well, as you describe that, it sounds to me almost like the progression of risk management. You talked about economic capital just a bit ago, and that concept I don't think really even existed back when we first met. But your discussion about firm-wide risk management and ultimately enterprise risk management was really creating a framework. And that framework seems to have been something that's become more standard. So you have that book, and I remember very clearly at the end of it, you were brave enough to make 10 predictions. And those 10 predictions were about the future of enterprise risk management. How did those turn out?
Well, I think I'll let you and the listeners, make that judgment. But of the 10 predictions, I would say that there are 3 that I am the most proud of. One is that ERM will become the industry standard for risk management. And my book came out in 2003, and a recent survey showed that the majority of large companies, public companies with revenue over $1 billion have an ERM program. Another prediction was that chief risk officers will become prevalent in risk-intensive businesses, and we've definitely seen that at banks and financial institutions, but we're also seeing that in energy firms and other non-financial corporations. And then finally, the third prediction that I just want to highlight is that risk education will be a part of corporate training and college-level programs, and we see that quite a bit in some of the universities and executive training programs. And I think the level of training and education around enterprise risk management has never been better.
Well, and I think you're being humble. The review that I've done of those, and I think that others have done, at least 8 or 9 of the 10 are firmly in place. And I think anyone who has the courage to put those down in print in a book deserves credit when they turn out. So I think that's one of the reasons why I've advocated for people to look at that book, as well as the follow-up to it, which was about implementing enterprise risk management, because there are things in here. You had talked a few minutes ago about focusing on market, credit, and operational risk, and we used to define those in these silos, as you referred to. That's changed so much that we have now seen this bringing of enterprise risk management into the life of a business, into how organizations function. So a lot of credit to you for that. And people will know as they read my work and hear me talk that I often suggest they read these books of yours. So I think you're to be congratulated, and you don't need to be humble when you've done a good job.
Thanks,
now,
Dave.
In your work, you're doing board level work, but you're also doing advisory work. Sometimes I have executives say, I'm interested in starting an ERM program. And one of the things that immediately comes into my head is, do you fully understand what that desire means in terms of changing the corporate culture and the amount of work that's put in? When you've worked with organizations like this, or even ones that already have a risk function, what are some of the common pitfalls or opportunities that you've seen in these when you start that advisory process?
Yeah. So over the decades, I've had my own consulting practice for 18 years, and prior to that, I worked for large consulting firms. I probably worked on close to 75 different enterprise risk management programs. And the one thing that is very surprising to me, and I would also say disappointing to me, is that a lot of companies, I would say over 80% of companies, spend a lot of time on opinion-based risk assessments, and they'll turn those risk assessment output into heat maps and use that as the basis of executive and board reporting. And I find that a real misuse of resources and time because of the underlying flaws in the methodology. So I'll give you an example. So the process typically includes a group of people within the company from different departments, and they'll go through a process of identifying dozens of risks, and they'll say for each one of these risks, let's rate it from 1 to 5 in terms of probability, and then 1 to 5 in terms of severity. And then we'll multiply the two ratings to come up with a risk score. Well, it sounds reasonable, and it sounds logical, but when you think about the underlying characteristic of a risk, it's really a distribution of probabilities and severities. And it's basically a distribution curve or bell curve that may have different shapes and sizes. And when you do that, in terms of simplifying it into opinion-based, one point that's qualitative, in a heat map, you oversimplify the risk, and the information itself is not actionable. So I'll give you a very simple example. The probability and severity of a company being attacked from cyber criminals. Well, it's happening hundreds, thousands of times a day, so the probability is high, but your firewall is able to block it, so the severity is low. So 5 times 1 is 5. Now, what's the probability and severity of a major data breach? Well, hopefully the probability is low, but the severity is high. So a 1 times 5 is a 5. So when you think about the underlying methodology, it really gives you erroneous answers. And I'm not cherry-picking the example. You could go through many different risk examples and come up with that problem. And so when I see companies spend a lot of time on risk assessments and heat maps and use that as an end product, I think that's a real waste of resources and time. It's not that I don't think risk assessments are important, but it's the way it's done, the methodology is done, and it should be combined with good risk quantification and metrics. But even with risk quantification metrics, I like to hear someone's opinion about what they see in terms of those metrics. So I want to see data. I want to see analytics, but I want to have someone's opinion. But I don't want the opinion without the facts. I don't want the opinion without the analysis. So I think that is I would say, the major pitfall.
Well, and it's an attempt, it sounds like, to turn something that's not quantifiable into a number that makes us feel like we've got a better handle on something. But as you pointed out, the ratios or their measures relative to each other don't necessarily translate well. And I know others have tried to turn this into red, yellow, green heat maps, as you've discussed, and sometimes those suffer from the same issues. John Lukomnik, who had been on an early podcast, said, how do you know green is green? Because there's not necessarily data backing that up. It's just a sense of opinion if you don't have people looking at it. This gives me more interest in how organizations interpret this reporting. So let's take a look at 2 places. One would be someone within the organization, the chief risk officer, for example, like you were, and like we've seen show up at more and more organizations. And then the other one would be somebody on the board who has some experience within risk, whether it's risk-taking, but some knowledge beyond the just general sense of what risk is, more in the field of risk management. How important are those 2 factors to helping the rest of the board understand these potential shortcomings?
Yeah. So this message resonates very well when I talk to directors and senior executives. Deep down, they recognize the pitfalls of this kind of reporting. The heat maps, the risk assessments. I mean, recently I worked with a CEO who basically said to me and the board that this kind of information made him feel vulnerable, that he really doesn't understand the true risk of the organization. And I've heard that many times from different board members and executives. But, the other side of it is maybe it's better than nothing, right? If they didn't get risk metrics and reporting in the past, at least they're getting something. But I think risk professionals need to move beyond this, in terms of assessing risk and identifying risk. They really need to quantify risk and be able to put it into a decision-making framework. So when it comes to management and the board, they play different roles. The board is there to provide governance, provide policy and oversight. Management is there to execute on the risk management program, to make business decisions, pricing decisions, to accept or mitigate risk on a day-to-day basis. So because they play different roles, it is important that we customize our work and metrics and reporting to those audiences. So board reporting should not be an executive summary of management reporting because they fundamentally play different roles.
Well, and I think that's a really interesting way of considering how to communicate. And I've talked about this with some others, and that's keeping your audience in mind. And when we consider CROs and the skills that they bring or key success factors for them, how important is it that a CRO understands business, meaning the idea of taking risk to achieve business goals?
That is an absolutely critical skill for a chief risk officer or any risk professional at any stage of their careers. It's not to understand risk from a risk perspective, but to really understand it from a business perspective, because every business needs to take risk to be in business, and there are different parts of the companies that are responsible for different parts of the business. They have to make pricing decisions, customer decisions, operational decisions. So I think it is very critical, as you said, David, that the chief risk officer really thinks about the needs of the audience in terms of the line management, senior management, and the board. What decisions and actions do they need to take given their different roles? And how do I customize my information and my analytics to support those decision making? Because if we do enterprise risk assessment or even enterprise risk quantification, that's really not adding value. I mean, it really adds value when we do enterprise risk management, and the only way we could do that is to impact business decisions.
Well, and now your work, my impression of it is anyway, that it's shifted more of the past 10 years to be focused on board-level initiatives. And I know those then carry out through the organization. But in talking to board members, how has receptivity to this concept of risk governance changed over this last decade? Is it something that you walk into a boardroom and people immediately know what you're talking about? Or, for those of us who've been around for a few decades, we're kind of used to getting pushback? Is the still there?
Yeah, David, I know you bring back some old memories, but I would say that it has been a sea change in terms of the level of attention that corporate directors are paying to risk management. So 20 years ago, it would be the end of a board agenda, 30-minute presentation that might be squeezed into 10 minutes at the end. And directors literally might not seem interested until maybe until they talk about director in liability and insurance and topics that are much more relevant, immediate relevance to them. But I would say today, risk oversight has really risen to the top of the board agenda and attention. Boards are spending more time because it is one of the few areas where directors could have a real impact on an organization in terms of challenging management in a constructive way, in terms of setting risk appetite, in terms of monitoring the risk culture, or asking the right questions and demanding the right information. All those things have a huge influence on how a company operates. And so I think it has risen to the top of board agendas. They are focusing on board oversight of ERM and strategic risk. They're focusing on cybersecurity. They're focusing on disruptive risk, like the pandemic that we are experiencing right now, and I think that's going to, have implications for many years to come.
Well, and I think I want to echo the bit about disruption. We have a survey that the DCR runs called the Crisis Sentiment Index, and the May report is just coming out. It'll be released in the public on Friday. But one of the statistics that came out of that was almost 50% of the respondents indicated the companies or the boards of their companies are reconsidering their entire business model. 50%, half the companies. And if that doesn't open up a whole host of risks, strategic risks, and other, I don't know what else defines that disruption. They also are focused on opportunities, which I think is another thing that you've alluded to in other places, where risk can be helpful in capturing some of those opportunities. So this is going to be a pretty dynamic time. Organizations that maybe are in this crisis might be considering a risk committee if they don't have one already. One of your predictions was that audit committees would evolve into risk committees, and I think in a separate form. I know you're on both kinds of committees, risk committee and an audit committee. If a board is considering this, where should they start? Should the organization already have a risk infrastructure in place, or is the creation of a risk committee the place that we start, and then we have the organization build out the risk management infrastructure?
It depends on where the company is, the board composition in terms of the directors and also the maturity of its ERM program. I mean, ultimately, we have to ask, what is the agenda for the risk committee? What are the reporting? What are the policies? What is the charter for that organization? But one of the kind of ongoing debate is, should we have a separate risk committee, or should risk management be part of the audit committee or the full board's agenda? And I've seen it work in different ways at different companies. But with one large energy firm, one of the directors expressed a perspective that I agree with, and I'd like to share that with you and your listeners. And she had experience with both audit committees and risk committees, and she said to me, James, the audit committee and the risk committee, they wear very different hats, and they have very different scopes. So the audit committee is paid to think inside the box. It's literally, you really have to think about checking the box, make sure that we're in compliance with, SEC requirements, FASB requirements, Sarbanes-Oxley, public disclosure, etc. Right? You don't want to be creative in your audit work, or you don't want to be creative in your financial accounting. Whereas the risk committee is paid to think outside the box. We're paid to think about the unexpected. We want to look around corners and see what's coming down the pipeline in terms of risk. And so that the mandate, the scope, and the skills are fundamentally different. And I thought that was very well put, and something that large companies should consider.
Well, it's almost a difference between validating and anticipating.
Yeah, absolutely. So you think about internal audit or the audit committee. To me, it's like validating. It's like going to the doctors once a year to make sure you're in good shape and you're in good health. But on an ongoing basis, you want the input from a personal trainer. You want to input from a nutritionist, so that you do maintain good fitness and health on an ongoing basis. You're not going to strive to have good fitness and health by saying, I'm going to go to the doctor once a year, and I'll be happy with that, right? And you really need both. And I do believe there is some value in the three lines of defense in thinking about, second line versus third line.
Well, and I think your three lines of defense is slightly different from others, right? You include the board in that, don't you?
I do. That's one variation in how I think about it, because at most companies, the internal audit function is really supporting the board in providing oversight in terms of the second line, the risk and compliance function, and also the first line in terms of the line and functional units. I do not think the board is the fourth line defense. From a regulatory perspective, from a shareholder perspective, to me, in action, the board does function as a third line defense with support from internal audit.
Well, if you want to foster that outside-the-box thinking or anticipatory thinking that a risk committee might have, how would you populate that committee differently than, say, an audit committee?
Well, from an audit committee perspective, you really need the financial expertise, technical expertise that would fulfill its charter. From a risk committee, I would say you need good risk experts, governance experts, maybe IT, cybersecurity, and really good business people. People with maybe even a CEO background to be able to put the risk management perspective in terms of strategic risk and business management. So I think that the skill sets are different, the agendas are different, but ultimately I think there are three things that the risk committee need to do, and I use the acronym GPA to set that up. So one is governance. What is the calendar and topics and issues that we're going to provide governance over, so that we're spending time appropriately? What is the relationship between the risk committee and the risk functions, the chief risk officer, the compliance function? So P is for policy. How do we set policy to communicate our expectations, to set up a risk appetite statement and a risk escalation policy to make sure that there's good transparency in the company. And then A is assurance. How do we provide assurance that the risk management program is effective? What kind of reporting, what kind of feedback loop are we going to rely on? So governance, policy, and assurance are the three things that are really, really critical.
Well, and a number of people who are listening to this are going to be people who come through risk functions or chief risk officers, and they're interested in board positions. I mean, it's a place that people see their chance to play in the strategy, help organizations think and take risk better. Are there any specific resources that you would direct aspiring board members to in order to enhance their chances of being successful board members?
Sure. Well, first of all, I would first like to say that board work is extraordinarily valuable work, and it is an opportunity for risk professionals to continue to learn and also to continue to contribute in terms of value. And I've found it very rewarding myself. And resources would include the NACD, the National Association of Corporate Directors. I've been quite active in that community, and every time I go to an event, I leave more inspired, I learn something, and I make some really good contacts and relationships. David, I think your resource, the DCRO, is wonderful. I think it's ahead of its time in terms of building an online community of risk professionals and directors, and I think that's another great resource for risk professionals. And beyond those two, I would just say that we should all kind of reflect on our own skill set and say, how do we fill out other skills? So if you're strong in financial skills, how do we acquire better operational skills or cybersecurity skills? If you work on financial and operational risk, how do you think about risk management from a strategic perspective, in tying ERM to strategy? Because ultimately a board's going to look for directors that's going to provide the skill sets, the unique perspectives that's going to help them in terms of governance and oversight.
Well, and James, this is really a great discussion. I appreciate everything you've done for the industry. We've actually come up to the end of our 30 minutes, which happens so quickly whenever the conversation is an interesting one like this. I want to thank you for everything you do for the DCRO. Thank you for mentioning the DCRO. I think most of the people who are listening to this will hopefully be a part of that. But I do mean that. As I mentioned in the book that I had just written, meeting you in the early 90s was one of the best things in my career because it gave me a chance to learn from you. And I think that other people who are aspiring board members or boards who are looking to take their organizations through a really difficult time, or even in normal times, are going to benefit from understanding more about ERM and this different perspective that the board brings, but the essential nature of having this infrastructure in the organization. So thanks for everything you've done to help that happen. And thank you so much for the time you spent with us today.
Thank you, David, for everything you do. I really enjoyed spending time with you and your listeners.